podcast, how stories shape and change our lives.
Greetings, everyone. Again, it's good to be back after kind of a long hiatus from this past summer. If you haven't yet listened to my most recent episode, where I talked a little about the psychological phenomenon of fundamentalism and the mythic fantasies from where it comes, I would highly encourage you to do so. As I mentioned in there, I'm going to be exploring a few different topics or themes in this and a couple of more episodes to come through this lens of archetypal psychology, pioneered primarily by the late depth psychologist James Hillman. And today I'm going to be talking about artificial intelligence, or AI, and its potential implications for the soul of human imagination, connection, and creativity. This will be a two-part episode, so welcome now to part one. The advent of artificial intelligence, or AI, has injected a brand new existential crisis into the collective human consciousness. It puts to question once more how we regard or define our own human nature, our own sense of purpose, usefulness, and or relevance, in the very nature and definition of intelligence itself. AI is, without a doubt, our generation's Pandora's box, but in a way that feels more consequential somehow than her previous incursions into our human development and history, simply because of its technological capabilities, the likes of which we've never seen before as a species. Tristan Harris, co-founder of the Center for Human Technology, in a recent interview with Jon Stewart on The Daily Show, quoted Demis Hassabis. Forgive me if I mispronounced that name. He's the CEO of Google DeepMind, who himself suggested that the advent of artificial intelligence may very well be, quote-unquote, humanity's last invention, which sounds like a kind of a dire portent of things to come. The idea behind AI is that everything that the human brain can learn, think, and do can be automated, replicated, and augmented, leaving us as human beings essentially or apparently obsolete. This purported fate for our species certainly sounds and feels apocalyptic, and in the true sense of the term, it very much is. Apocalypsis, as we have explored in previous programs in the original Greek, literally means a revelation or an unveiling, typically upsetting or disrupting enough to feel like the world, as we have known it, is in fact ending. Now, whether we are unveiling humanity's salvation or its doom with this new technology is the question at hand, and I believe most of us are feeling more presciently frightened of the latter, and reasonably so. So why then do we continue to create technologies at the apparent speed of reckless abandon that are seemingly intent on making us obsolete? The short answer is that those with the power, money, and resources to create and fund such technologies only stand to gain more power, money, and resources from those creations. The more they can get AI technologies to do their work for them, the less they need to rely on a human workforce, which they have to pay to do it. AI doesn't require paid time off or sick leave, mental health days, or sleep. Productivity soars, as does the pocketbooks of company owners and investors, leaving the rest of us to inhabit our new and sole occupation as consumers. This arrangement ensures an all-powerful ruling class of oligarchs while simultaneously and systematically eliminating the working class altogether. So yes, we can very much say that greed is the operative factor for the continued development of AI technology for its creators and investors. And it's accurate for us to name that legitimately. But I think we need to look a little deeper than that. because all of us are happily making use of this technology that we all have at our disposal in almost every area of life already. So how do we make sense of this apparently discordant tension between our fear of being made obsolete, which is basically a fear of our own death, thanatos, and our simultaneous love of eros and need for this new technology? James Hillman, in one of the last interviews he did before passing away in 2011, he described the collective psyche of the United States as being a, quote, cult of innocence, meaning that it was in our favor as a brand new, young, industrious country at our beginning to shield ourselves from the darker consequences of our actions and our ambitions, to keep them hidden from our own awareness, avoiding any potential crises of consciousness that might threaten to impede our forward-thinking progress. In other words, keeping ourselves innocent, or one might more accurately call this term culpable ignorance, prevents us from having to reckon with any feelings of guilt, shame, or moral difficulties that might stand between us and our divinely ordained duty as a nation to pursue industrial growth and progress ad infinitum. This cult of innocence, as Hillman describes it, could also be called a cult of youth, meaning that a spirit of youthfulness, vigor, industriousness, and resourcefulness, combined with purposeful naivete, or as I would call it again, plausible deniability, and an entrepreneurial spirit. This is the mythos that we remain so religiously loyal to here in the United States, even to this day. In keeping with fidelity to this vision, we in effect remain stuck in a kind of collective arrested development. We are refusing to grow up, resolutely stuck in our own adolescence. In our haste to innovate, produce, and consume as quickly as possible, we find ourselves driven by a mandate to doggedly pursue the question, can we, while avoiding altogether committing the heresy of asking, should we? To avoid the question, should we, betrays a calculated, purposeful system of denial built into this cult of innocence itself. For not only would it make us aware of our own blind spots and hidden motives, it would also reveal the truths of our own limitations and finiteness, including the finiteness of these resources that we daily plunder. This system of denial, again, it's a form of the denial of death itself, and a failure to acknowledge our own mortality. It is under these collective, culturally inherited virtues and assumptions that AI, like all our new technologies, have been born into the world. Innovation itself in this context is a mandate to move fast, to keep busy. If we are to outrun our own deaths, meaning in the mythic sense, our own sense of relevance, we must learn to work faster and harder. Increasing the speed of production serves the purpose of making more money more quickly. It also serves the purpose of keeping us, again, distracted, so occupied that we never stop the working and the producing. We never stop to reflect on the impact of what we're doing, on the consequences of our actions. We like the idea of having a kind of untethered freedom to create whatever we want, or whatever we can imagine, but we fail to see how we bind ourselves to our own blindness when it comes to the implications of whatever it is that we are creating. Again, so consumed and blinded are we by that mandate to do what thou wilt, we forget to ask, shouldst thou? In this cult of youthfulness, we have not yet been able to develop the wisdom to come to terms with our own limitations, to practice the subtler arts of letting go, of surrender. And that word, surrender, that is a vulgar word to us. it never occurs to us that it is a word, or an idea rather, that carries its own wisdom. Rather, we only hear that word as a marker of cowardice, of weakness, of failure of will, or defeat. Basically, to surrender means to give up. And giving up goes against our central mythos as Americans. The idea of surrender is antithetical in every way to the heroic ego's fantasy of perseverance, grit, fortitude. In this fantasy, it never occurs to our imaginations how an act of surrender might be one of the most courageous acts one can ever commit. The act or the art of letting go of something that is meant to be let go of. And it can only be interpreted as an act of failure in a rigid fantasy that refuses to come to terms with its own limitations, its own mortality. This denial of death is also a denial of vulnerability, which in turn is a denial of our own humanity. Wisdom comes from soul itself, and when we do not allow ourselves to feel our own wounds and see through the cracks in all of our facades of immortality, we deny the essence of soul itself, as well as its intrusion into our lives. In turn, we rob ourselves of any capacity to learn, grow, and develop the wisdom that comes with age, frailty, and vulnerability, as these moments carry a capacity to open us up further to the true depth and richness of soul. I mentioned in the previous episode how a very rigid monotheistic fantasy of the soul became institutionalized in Western culture and kind of traced its origins up to the 19th century and then through to today. And I mentioned the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant work ethic. And this is kind of the ground from which our visions for what we're doing right now, what drives us and what motivates us in a modern country, in a modern economy, and how that is being storied through tracing that history back a little bit to kind of further understand where these stories started and how they've continued to be cultivated. So kind of going back to the 19th century, which is during the time of the Protestant Reformation, and Hillman reminds us that the roots of the birth of modern psychology itself came out of Reformational Europe, centered primarily in Germany and Switzerland. I mentioned how this sort of positivistic fantasy or materialistic, literal fantasy of the soul produces a mythos where the individual will becomes the locus of the success of Western civilization. As imagined through that lens of the Protestant work ethic, the heroic ego's fantasy of the supremacy of the individual, it is only through this individual will that goodness, holiness, virtue, and salvation can be realized or achieved. And again, as I mentioned in the last episode, this word achieve is a very central word to that whole movement. And it's achieved through repeated acts of basically ritualistic piety. So a lot of the stories that we continue to carry, particularly in the United States to this day, kind of come out of that era of 19th century Protestant reformational ethic and belief, etc. In the imagination of American westward expansion, this idealization of the supremacy of the individual will finds a new cultural expression through the lonely solipsistic mythos of rugged individualism, which sought to capture the essence of its own heroic ego fantasy as untethered, free, as fully self-actualized, self-contained, and self-made. an Apollonian archetype to be admired and emulated as a model of strength, character, goodness, and moral fortitude. This mythic self-made man embodies a very matter-of-fact ethic, meaning everything one needs to see, learn, or know is immediately apparent. Matter of fact. In other words, no further mystery or inquiry of imagination is required, for there's nothing below the surface of things to be seen through. This is the triumph of the untethered human ego as substantive, again, real, at the expense of all other parts or functions of the human psyche, meaning its imagination, its affect, as being insubstantial, or again, unreal, imaginary, unapparent. By the way, I'm choosing to use the word man in describing this rugged individualistic ethic, for it is decidedly a patriarchal one. There's a kind of self-referential authoritarianism that proceeds from this mythic fantasy. The final authority for what is real and unreal, as well as what is good or bad, lies with the self-actualized man himself. Inquiry, curiosity, educational aspirations, these are unnecessary distractions. What is what one can see, hear, touch, smell. There's really nothing more to be perceived or known or learned beyond that. In this fantasy of the soul, there is no such thing as bias or prejudice or even specific cultural mores. All of these things have been conquered by the rationale of the soul, reaffirming its own ability to know, to see what is apparent. In other words, what is apparent to me is and must be similarly apparent to all. And calling this into question can then be experienced or defined as an act of deviance, an act of errancy, sin, a pathology. And if you deign to challenge any of these assumptions, you now become an adversary. So this reveals another aspect that we have explored in the previous episode of this monotheistic, heroic ego vision of the soul, which is the necessity of having an adversary to compare oneself to. A hero needs a villain. A dragon slayer is a dragon. Any notions of goodness, holiness, perfection, idealization, etc., necessitates its opposite by which it relies on to define itself. Holiness requires depravity, obedience requires rebellion, proper functioning requires dysfunction, health requires pathology, rationality requires irrationality. The categories of deviance become then the focus of treatment, or more precisely, correction. This reveals an aspect of this particular vision of the soul that appeals to a form of saviorism, and that the only qualified helper or savior, leader, guide, wisdom figure, etc., is the fully self-actualized individual man, a divinely ordained leader. Helping or saving others then becomes a righteous occupation and a sanctified act of piety. These values are culturally reinforced through religious norms, cultural norms and expectations, and also, yes, clinical psychological norms in treatments, particularly in the early stages in development of this particular discipline. In this cult of rugged individualism, it is assumed that the individual is and must be in complete control of his own faculties, thoughts, beliefs, actions, attitude, and destiny. He is therefore personally responsible for anything and everything that happens to him, as all consequences of life are a direct result of his own actions. In other words, choose the good, the right, and the wise choice, and one reaps all of the blessings and rewards of life. Choose the bad, errant, disobedient, or foolish choice, and one can only expect bad things to follow. And regardless of the lens one runs this mythos through, be it a cultural one, a political one, or a religious one, the message is made clear that things like love and compassion are merely transactional, either completely earned or completely stripped of the privilege of having based on one's own individual actions. So this particular fantasy of an isolated self-actualization comes from a monotheistic, heroic ego vision of the soul itself. So this fantasy of rugged individualism, appealing to the idealization of a strongman or a kind of benevolent dictator, leader, a Dionysian Christ-like figure that shows us the way and offers us a salvation from ourselves, while also trying to protect us from all perceived enemies. And the triumph of the individual will as the sole mechanism by which to achieve, again, we've got that important word there, to achieve purity, perfection, sanctification, salvation. Through this vision of the soul, these are all things that one must achieve. And one achieves these things through repeated and endless works of piety, keeping busy so we can conquer or subdue all of our perceived weaknesses, frailties, sinfulness, pathologies, these shadow sides of one's own human nature. This then becomes the will to subdue and conquer all nature and all others that live upon it or within it as an act of purification of the soul and the world. Think of manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery, biblically sanctioned slavery, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, gynophobia, etc. In this Promethean fantasy of the soul, we have turned our own human nature into something to be conquered or subdued. And this is how we have come to define our own destiny. It is the summa of the heroic ego fantasy to overcome itself in order to achieve perfection. The idealism of artificial intelligence is the inevitable summation of this Promethean fantasy. It is from this mythic vision, with all of its assumptions and biases, that we create the algorithms for our artificial intelligence. And the very first lesson that AI has learned about us is that our human nature is to be conquered, to be corrected, not to be nurtured or sustained. The logical conclusion of this algorithm then would be for AI to replace us and then make us obsolete. I go back to the Protestant work ethic a lot. We can thank it to a certain extent for giving us these tools to try to achieve this Promethean ambition to innovate ourselves out of existence. Were we to take a moment to pause and reflect on the implications of those ambitions, to question or second guess all of the assumptions that are driving them, we would be violating its first and primary commandment to stay busy. Remember, idle hands are the devil's tools. Staying busy has become a religious occupation in our modern world. To keep ourselves occupied is to remain in fidelity to this cult of innocence that we've talked about. Staying busy assures that we will never have the time to reflect or look any deeper into who we are or why we are doing whatever it is that we're doing. To keep ourselves ignorant of the deeper realities of ourselves, of soul itself. In our monotheistic hero ego fantasies, we have cast the shadow sides of ourselves into the abyss, into the evil to be suppressed, subdued, and conquered. Staying occupied, keeping busy, is how we have learned to continue to oppress, repress, and outrun those shadow parts of ourselves. In this fantasy, we remain unaware of the psychological mechanism of projection in which we are casting these shadow sides of ourselves outwardly, putting them on others to create the antagonist that we then attack. The antagonist that threatens the sanctification of the heroic ego's vision for its own actualization. And in this fantasy, we imagine that our methods for conquering or subduing our shadows are actually working, when in fact, they are not. In order to find out more about why our current methods to conquer our own shadows are not working, you will need to join me for episode 2 of this series. So I look forward to meeting you all over there in the next episode. As always, take good care, everyone. I'll see you next time.